Well, it's just my flippant way of speaking of something. And no, I don't think I can cure anybody from being an asshole. But I could begin this discussion by claiming that I think that we are all assholes in some way. And when I proposed that idea to a group of consciousness developing, consciousness driven people from Massachusetts, not a single one of them responded to it in the affirmative. No. And what I will say is this: people have idealized themselves because ego feels so damn vulnerable, it has to protect itself. And thus, the assholes are not limited only to the losers, as people like to say, but to many of the winners who are driven and driven and driven. I would make this point too, that it is possible for every decision that we make to be folly. I realized that about myself 25 years ago, that everything that I have ever done could have turned into something awful. Sometimes they have turned into awful decisions, but most of them have not. And you can say, well, the Holy Spirit has fixed it, which would be a lovely, lovely thought. Or something else, maybe just the nature of this physical reality, where there are so many doorways, and most of the doorways are fairly sanguine, are fairly friendly and harmless. There are some harmful doorways. And so, for the most part, we are just shooting from the gut. If people think that they're making rational decisions because they think that they're existentialists, they haven't looked into existentialism deeply enough. Basically, everything comes from the gut. It is not rational, it is pre-rational. It comes from an emotional center, which itself is based upon need. So here we are, these profoundly needy beings, who are dedicated to seeking pleasure and avoiding pain. There's not a philosopher who would disagree with that. That's British. Now, what else is there about us? Well, from a Socratean point of view, we are this consciousness that is always seeking because it's empty, it's always lacking. It is defined by lack. It is so purely nothingness. Socrates called consciousness le néant, the nothingness. And that's how he described it for more than 700 pages of being in nothingness. The human being in its nothingness. Buddha would speak of the same nothingness and talk about how we are on fire with desire. He gave the fire sermon one day, and it was quite short to his Sangha, his followers, and he simply pointed out, I think he held a candle, he pointed out that we are on fire all the time with desire. And of course, you know that the Buddha's way was to transcend desire. Extraordinarily difficult thing to do. Where others, like the Maharaj, Nisargadatta Maharaj, would point out to us, and so would Krishnamurti point out to us, that it is not necessary to give up desire. The desire should be the desire for truth. Excellent. Pristine. Buddha also said you don't have to give up the love of nature. But a lot of other love should be given up. Obviously, agreeing with the church fathers, concupiscible love, which is physical love, fleshy love, in itself transient and all that, and of course that's condemned by those who want to transcend the body, and thus you get that in the religions. But then there are other ways to go to this. Tantra. What I'm saying all this for is to point out that there are so many different directions for seeking to avoid suffering and to fulfill ourselves in a way that transcends us, takes us somehow out of this narrow box that we call the ego, People want to get beyond that. Thus, people seek various forms of ecstasy. And if they don't believe in pursuing those forms of ecstasy, maybe they sit home, drink beer, and eat nachos all night long, watching television until they pass out, and then go to the grind again. Why am I saying all this? Because of the nature of the human reality. We are these highly self-idealizing beings who will do anything sometimes and justify it in order to, for ego, as I say, for ego to seek the higher ground. Ego always seeks the higher ground. And thus, I would say that since that's always going on, since it's always self-interest fundamentally at heart here, that we are all essentially assholes. Now, do I have some formula? Do I have some quick fix-it glue? Am I in possession of something that could remedy this? There are lots of strategies I would leave to other people. I understand Professor Jordan Peterson has wonderful goals that he puts people onto, but nothing is going to put out the fire, and nothing is going to prevent us from making decisions based upon irrational conditionings in many, many cases. And thus, nothing is going to keep us from being assholes. But we can be assholes who are aware of ourselves as assholes. We can see, if we look closely, how damn mechanical so many decisions are. We like to maybe, as I used to when I was younger, be champions of free will in the face of overwhelming evidence for material determinism. No, somehow we are free at heart. And in a way we are, but not in terms of making these decisions. Our decisions do wind up defining us because of the actions that follow. But these decisions do not really come from rational places unless we're just doing some kind of job. But when it comes to ourselves, we're driven by various demons. And who knows about the ones that we don't know of? Who knows about the invisible ones? And so, all I could ever recommend is that we see, as Krishnamurti would say, as Nisargadatta Maharaj, the brilliant old man who knew exactly what he was, and that was simply to be present. Krishnamurti would say, watch everything that goes on all the time. If you sit quietly, pay attention. If you're in relationship with people in a conversation, pay attention. Be awake, awaken. Be awake, and you'll see something that goes on. If you watch long enough, you'll see how this, even the desire to speak comes from a depth of the human condition which has such a need for social interaction. We are by our very nature relational beings. Thus, it is considered to be inhumane and a violation of one of the constitutional rights to put a man into solitary confinement for very long periods, because it will cause the person to become insane, quite simply. There has to be something. If you look closely, I say this to whoever's listening, pay attention to your own thoughts. Don't interfere with them. Just observe. This thought arises, that thought arises. Accept them. They're fine. They're like your own children. They arise out of you. Also notice something else about how they just arise automatically. I mean, they're stimulated very often by a sight or a sound or somebody else's words, but they arise out of you, the response. And if you look closely, you will also see that thoughts, even when you're all alone, as you are so often, when you're thinking, you cannot stop thinking. You'll notice something about them. What is that? That they always imply that someone is listening. They always imply a listener. Thought is rehearsed dialogue. I am not the first to say that. Psychologists will point that out, some of them. Thought is rehearsed dialogue. There is always an implied listener. That is why I would agree with those who say that writers have to write. Of course, they have to write. They have to manifest. That's a way of manifesting. And it doesn't matter that what they say may not be the ultimate truth. They simply have to write. They have to get people to pay attention because we are, by that, our nature, self-reflective, and we are somehow always incorporating the eyes of the other. The eyes of the other are with us even when we're all alone in the woods. And thus you can find evidence of it when you think all alone in the woods. I'm sorry, all this adds up to being some kind of asshole, and you can say whatever you like about it, but there's only one way to deal with it, in my opinion. No matter what you do, you can become Pope and President and good-willed as Kant, whose categorical imperative would demand that you have wings in order to abide by it. Yes, the angel wings. But in my opinion, the way I look at the human being, we're still capable of doing really moronic things. Our best intentions can go gang agley, as Bobby Burns would say. We don't really have control of this world. We can just roll the dice under certain circumstances with the fair certainty that things will turn out in the short run. But that's the life of the asshole.